and all other protocol respected. I think it's a pleasure for me to be here again in Uganda. It's been always a heartwarming experience to return to Uganda. Incidentally, it was said that the second coming of a Christ would be to a town with many hills, and Kampala seemed to have claimed that prophecy, except that we also are battling to claim it because Yaoundé is a town on 12 hills. With that having been said, the question now comes to us, where is Africa going with research capacity in health education? And when Professor Sewakambo asked me to talk about this, I had to spend quite a few nights trying to battle with what I could actually bring to the audience that is good. So I decided to start with a historical perspective, how there have been some shifts. And the first logical place to go to is where they started 100 years ago. The Flexner report was produced in 1910. And at that time, they were looking for ways to integrate modern science into the curricula at university-based schools. And the reforms had to equip health professionals with new knowledge. And what the 20th century experienced was that there was a doubling of the lifespan during that period. Then there was this health for all by the year 2000. And when 2000 arrived, there were glaring gaps and inequities in health, which persisted within. There were inabilities to share dramatic health advances equitably, and there were fresh health challenges that were looming in our faces. New infections, there was a demographic explosion, epidemiological transitions, and health systems worldwide were struggling to keep up. Certain systemic problems did persist, and the issue was that the curricula were fragmented, they were outdated, some were static, and the graduates that came out were ill-equipped. There were mismatches in competencies to patients and population needs, and there was very poor teamwork. There was gender stratification, and the focus was so narrow that it did not quite meet the expectations of all. There are certain current challenges to health that are still on, and these are all affecting or are dependent on the health systems. We have epidemiological and demographic transitions, as I mentioned. There's professional differentiation, and there's population demands, and there's technological innovations. And we have to keep abreast with all of these if we must provide the necessary health to the populations that we are addressing. Then came the Lancet report, which was done in 2010. And this is exactly where I took off to be able to bring to you the way in which we need to address health professionals today. In the world, by 2010, there were just about 2,420 medical schools, and the report said that 467 of these were either of medicine or departments of public health, but there is an indeterminate number of post-secondary nursing educational establishments. All of these schools are training about 1 million health professionals per year. There is a maldistribution of many sorts. First, you notice that the population of the world is skewed, and it's heaviest in Asia. Then you realize that the burden of disease is huge in Africa, and that the number of medical schools actually shrinks in Africa, and it's almost exploding in South America. And when you look at the workforce, again, Africa is almost having a season in the middle, and the rest of the world basically is galloping forward. So in this skewness of medical schools, Africa again is suffering the greatest burden because there are less than 2 medical schools per 10 million of the population, and something needs to be done about that. Well, the report said that there needs to be a philosophical imperative if we must begin to address these inequities, and that all health professionals in all countries must look for ways to mobilize knowledge and to engage in critical reasoning and ethical conduct, to be competent to participate in patient and population-centered health systems, but also to assure universal coverage of high quality with comprehensive services that are essential for good health equity. Now, they demonstrated that there were 3 generations of reforms from the 1900s to 2000. First, on issues that the educational system was one that was science-based, and then moved over to being problem-based, and now it is system-based. And with those, actually have different types of focus, and you have the institutional, university-based academic, and the health education systems, which actually show that there have been major shifts in paradigm, where in the 19th century, essentially, it was an informative kind of learning that produced experts. In the 20th century, it was a formative learning that produced professionals. And now in the 21st century, what that should translate to is transformative learning that will produce change agents. And these 3 fundamental shifts would mean that we would move away from facts memorization to searching, analysis, and synthesis of information for decision making. We also need to seek professional credentials. We'll move away from seeking professional credentials to achieving core competencies for effective teamwork in health systems, and from a non-critical adoption of educational models to a creative adaptation of global resources to address the local priorities. There are certain poverty challenges that hinder us from taking on these as an integral, or research as an integral part of health education. And I want to start off first with the poverty of nations. Because of the limited resources, we often direct funds into other pressing needs. These pressing needs are sometimes political, and the limited resources do not favor a proper budgeting. The population would respond or provide or does a street response by seeking for alternatives to different guidelines that are given to them. The poverty of nations sometimes do not favor rational thinking, and health gains are therefore not directly palpable, and we quite often respond to emotions. In Africa's total reliance on science, the African universities were quickly introduced by the colonial powers, and they were modeled on Western examples. They were not given sufficient time to adapt to the kinds of studies and curricula that were unique or would address the problems of Africa with an African background and perspective. They became quite costly, and no one could tell who was going to pay for this, who would make the decision for such funding to be available. And again, they could not balance teaching and research. The whole system was or is currently almost completely under Western control, especially with the scientific journals, the peer review mechanisms, the citation indices, to the point where this poses a very severe limitation on third world universities who hold valuable information under the claim, therefore, that it is not publishable. If you look at those who are funding research in Africa, and I use the malaria example, you would notice that it's heavily those in the north, with a very small, a very small portion that is coming directly from all the African nations. If you look at what Africa funds, then you realize that a lot of the talents would respond to the government, and they are the whims and caprices of the governments, because then they could be tossed or sent anywhere, and you cannot really criticize the government because you will be biting the finger that's feeding you. And with that, a lot of talents get taken away from the university into administrative duties because of this very heavy dependence on government. But we need a critical mass if we have to talk to governments about funding research. And when you look at the publishing landscape, then you realize that certain countries are actually towering. And but let this not fool you, because if you divide the number of publications by the GDP, then you notice that there are other countries that are actually doing very, very well, and these are the mostly darkened countries. Zimbabwe, it's because of the economic collapse that alleviated the score or their index for them to be so dark. Between governments and universities, I think I've already mentioned that. And the areas, therefore, to address in research capacity, I think, are the following. The first thing I'd like to talk about is that Africa needs to recognize its science and its competitors, that science has formidable competing influences and obstacles when it comes to influencing opinions. Emotions in general, out of fear and greed, but there's also religion and superstition, and there's also power and political unguided interests. We need to understand also some of the issues that drive the disease burden, and these would be, issues in population size and pressure, but also due to expanded economic activity. We have poverty, we have climate change, and all this complex web need to be understood by scientists so that they are not monodirectional in their thinking. We need to also understand the infectious disease nemesis, that every time that we look at infectious diseases, it's an interplay between the environment and that particular disease. And it's important for us to go back to the basics, but also to look at operational issues in epidemiology, biology, the sociology of all of these diseases. In 2008, the ministers of health came together and kind of put out an Algier declaration on research for health, which can be grouped into three main areas. The first of them, which is creating an enabling environment. The second is about knowledge management. And the third is about carrying on research, both fundamental and operational. If I use those as the starting point, and since I'm a biochemist by training, I usually go back and conduct a checkabout experiments and use those three areas that the Algier Declaration said, and three desires for every intervention that needs to be worthy of its name. Then certain areas of research focus come into mind, which are basically the intersections between access, targeting, and quality, but also the enabling environment research, research operations, and knowledge management. I think Africa needs to develop its research sector. We know about the health sector, but I think the research sector needs to be developed. We need to have infrastructural investments. We need to strengthen good governance with the decentralization and the delegation of responsibilities, but also introducing a lot into what we do by monitoring and evaluating them. Information systems and data management need to be heightened. We need to create disease registries. Operational research and health systems need to be strengthened, and we need to look at the confounding variables if this research sector must be developed. An African agenda would require that universities in rich countries must be able to teach and be the centers of research, and that this research would focus on advancing our knowledge on a wide range of topics. But that universities also in poor countries, in addition to researching on the fundamentals, must also do a little of what is found in the North, but adapt the research and focus on implementation of knowledge as well that is already available and in the different circumstances of our different societies. In doing this, we must remember that Africa is a kaleidoscope of many or different populations and genetics, diversity of pathogens and of coevolutions, diversity of climatic conditions and ecosystems, diversity of cultural practices and religious beliefs, diversity of colonial past, but also diversity of urban and peri-urban and rural sites. We need to focus also on innovative knowledge management, which requires that evidence that is difficult to capture with the current indicators would therefore need us to define new indicators. We need to collect the right kind of data, and we need to capture the complexities in current practices, and we need to acquire beneficial technologies that would help advance our cause. The WHO TDR 2 years ago put out 10 compelling reasons for us to continue to research on infections of poverty. First, they said we need to break the vicious cycle of poverty and infectious diseases. We need to forge an escape route for the poor and the vulnerable. We need to tackle multiple problems, which brings in systems thinking. We need to commute the life sentence by mitigating the chronic and persistent lifelong infections and their secondary complications. We need to be prepared by putting up surveillance systems. We need to reach the hardest to reach populations by identifying ways to strengthen health infrastructure. We need to prevent loss in translation. We need to identify small changes that can make a very big difference. We also need to stay focused on the light at the end of the tunnel, hoping that it's not that of a screeching train. And we need to act quickly on what we currently know by reinforcing knowledge translation. For this to happen, for most of the scientists that already currently are practicing or those that need to enter, based on what we have in different schools, we need to do a reinvention of self. I would start first by focusing or talking about, what gives the strength of nations. And this strength of nations usually would depend on energy, whether from water, the earth, or the heavens, on their health preparedness, both in systems but also in emergency situations, on wealth and governance, on wealth, which would require that the economics is properly done and management and governance are heightened, but also on society, because then we need politics, communication, cultures, and traditions, and religion to be adequate and fulfilling. The next development decades usually would be defined by information science, by material science, by life sciences, and also by numerical sciences. And this would require that we integrate the traditional disciplines of biology, chemistry, and physics alongside with this. Again, as a biochemist, I made a checkerboard of chemistry, physics, and biology, but I took information science and material science, and therefore these are the new disciplines of areas we could do research in or orient our younger people into other competencies which were not in the old school. If you do the same again and you use the life sciences and the numerical sciences, then you get a whole range of new disciplines that currently are searchable and attainable, and people are getting in fast enough to acquire the necessary skills to have these performed. Therefore, somebody who studied biology and did public health would come out as a public health biotechnology, or a biochemist who does law could actually emerge as a patent lawyer, Or if you do medicine and communication, then you could be a health communicator and an editor of a journal. Or if you did life sciences and management, you could actually wind up being a CEO of a chocolate company. Or if you did history and medicine, you could actually end up being a medical historian. So these combinations are actually what or where we need to be encouraging our younger folks to go. We can look for as many, as I showed you in the last 2 slides, for things that have to do with the science and what we actually do for health. So I think it's time for us to share. And if we have to share, then I will just bring you at what level we need to share. I just present to you one project which I coordinated and show you where I've evolved to this quest for us to share. Is the PRD College, which was EU funded, in which we established for 24 trainees basic training in the molecular biosciences that took place here in Kampala. We then moved to advanced technology and knowledge transfer that took place in South Africa, and the soft skills that involved communication, management, leadership, and intellectual property issues that took place in Cameroon. But we require that each of the white folks in Europe must move to Africa for 2 to 3 months and study the reality of the disease under the reality check module, and that the Africans should go to Europe together with their other colleagues for 2 to 4 months and actually try to translate some of what they saw on the field into researchable questions. We had 24 trained between 2009 and 2013, and 92% completed training. The training ratio was 1 to 2 in Europeans to Africans, and that was successful. And not feeling satisfied with what had happened at that level, then I applied and got another program, Africa for Innovation, Mobility, Exchanges, Globalization, and Quality, or AFIMEC, which is currently on its way, offering 102 scholarships. We have 10 African partners and 10 associate European partners, and it's on science, engineering, energy, and medicine. And during that, I proposed 2 platforms, one of them which is called T.E.A.M, and the other one which is called T.I.M.E. And now, simply, what are platforms? Platforms enable us to create products or processes that support the present or future development, but would establish long-term capabilities of research and development institutes and provide structural reforms from where various products can emerge without the expense of new processes or technology. Why is there the need for platforms? Because we would increase in innovation, the ease of innovation, the ease of production, the cost effectiveness of procedures, and also in standardization. And T.E.A.M and T.I.M.E aim to train Africa's next generation of human welfare, innovative, and development scientists. For the T.E.A.M, which is actually technopole for the environment, animal and man, which captures the One Health concept, then the interactions are between man, the animal, and the environment. If you look at T.I.M.E, which is an association, then you have information science, matter, and energy that are in association. Now, the paradigm is actually one that recognizes that issues about human welfare are way beyond just human illness, and that if you look carefully, as the WHO does define, 75% of human diseases actually of animal origin. If you look at the way our traditional doctors heal, then you know that zootherapy provides clues for pharmacognosy and drug development. But then again, if you look at the way we manage our environment, then we are just killing it at every turn of the way. I was told that we Homo sapiens are the most destructive species that the Earth has ever known. And I think we need to do something about that. As a team example, therefore, we should be able to bring together health professionals that interact in a way that address both human and animal health together. These concepts are not new. It's the One Health concept. And that we need to integrate all the approaches, of the life sciences, so that whatever affects human welfare and how man affects the environment and climatic changes would be addressed in a manner that are holistic. We would therefore need a systems thinking approach that involves both veterinarians, environmental health scientists, and I'm glad that the Chancellor, who is a veterinarian, is here, human health care practitioners, epidemiologists, agronomists, economists, historians, and also culture gurus to make up a consortium. And I'm very confident that Thrive is a reflection of that. Now, we're hoping that information, material, and energy sciences will be able to help the One Health concept. But there needs to be a major shift in paradigm for biologists as we begin to embrace this. We need to acquire 4 technological processes that derive from engineering. The first of them is synthesis of the key nature blocks. The second of them is standardization of our procedures. The third is an abstraction for the extrinsic properties of matter. And the fourth of them is decoupling. Currently, a biologist almost does everything, and that is not helpful to the system. We need to share, and therefore the sharing imperative will require that the development of standard operating procedures for various common protocols should be shared across the board. Luckily, there are certain journals that will publish protocols so that people have. But a lot of these protocols are stored in our drawers, and nobody is having access to them to the point where sometimes we die and go away with them. We need to share new approaches in design strategies and innovations, but we also need to have a repository for common tools and instruments. We need a database of experts and centers of excellence where this expertise is, so that in calling for them, we would know exactly the right experts with an adequate, well-developed curriculum vitae. We need to develop control and quality systems and assure that all the measures and procedures are controlled. We need to share common manuals of procedures and raise public awareness, for science and technology. At the same time, I think we need a common pedagogic approach on the existence of excellence, on the professionalization of training, and the quality of mentorship and coaching, and being of exemplary conduct in honesty and integrity, and participatory approach for the extension, exploration, and engagement of candidates, and a knowledge assembly of the socioeconomic environment in which we live. I argue and contend that Africa should actually lodge in Pasteur's Quadrant, which actually require that we both embrace the fundamental aspects in a proactive model, but also that we apply these results for development purposes, which would be the reactive model. And by forging a bidirectional intercontinental synergies and cooperations, I think that we can achieve this. Just to demonstrate to you exactly what I mean by the Pasteur's Quadrant, I'm sure some of you would have heard this already from my previous talks. We can either have consideration for use for the science that we do, in which case we'll be applying, or we can look for a quest for the fundamental understanding, which basically would be looking at the basic mechanisms of how things work. When it's a yes for the fundamental understanding and a no for consideration for use, we're in pure basic science, and that's exemplified by Niels Bohr. On the other hand, if it's a no for fundamental understanding and a yes for consideration for use, we're in pure applied research, and again, that is exemplified by Thomas Edison. However, if it's a no for the fundamental understanding or a quest or consideration for use, then it's a research that systemizes a particular phenomenon, and that is exemplified by this bird watcher, Roger Tory Peterson. However, if it's a yes, both for fundamental understanding and a consideration for use, then we are in the use-inspired basic research quadrant, which effectively is exemplified by Louis Pasteur. The reason I contend that we should lodge in this quadrant is basically because sometimes when we are in applied research and questions arise, we shouldn't be running back to the north to look for solutions, but that we should be able to devise and work out the solutions. And if we understand how things work, it will be better when we now do the applications. I also argue that the new graduate should be trained more to come out competent as a manager, and for that to happen, he needs to understand exactly how projects are set up and be able, to have, ways in which he can monitor and evaluate his own progress by defining his indicators, but also the deliverables, the milestones, and above all, establish a very perfect Gantt chart with timelines and responsibilities before creating an activity-based budget and other resources. I think with that, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to say thank you for this invitation and thank you for all the different organizations that provided the information that I just shared with you. And thank you very much.